Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning into this story. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I never once believed our journey would be simple, but I also never imagined it would stretch on this long or take us through so many shades of desperation. It's been weeks, maybe months, since Brent and I first left my grandfather's cabin, when the world still felt like it was in the early stages of collapse. Back then, we thought the infection might be contained eventually, that some semblance of government control might remain. But the final sirens died weeks ago, and each day since has been a struggle against exhaustion, uncertainty, and isolation. I remember how it all began. The emergency alerts, the frantic broadcasts urging people to stay indoors and await instructions that never really came. My cabin, tucked deep in a forest, seemed like the perfect refuge from the outbreak, until it became apparent the infection wasn't limited to city centers. Animals, wildlife, stray people passing by. Everything around us hinted that our solitary hideout might not be enough. That's when Brent and I chose to venture into the unknown, driven by scraps of rumor about a safer northern region. Our path led us through eerily quiet towns, overgrown roads, and haunted farmlands. We met Ward, the roaming farmhand with a rusted pickup truck. We discovered Kara, Todd, and Nolan at a wilderness lodge, each of them clinging to the faint hope that the infection hadn't consumed all of civilization. Injured and weary, we banded together as a larger group, partly out of necessity, partly out of an instinctive understanding that a life alone against the infected was no life at all. The notion of a safe zone came from scattered bits of evidence, half-broken radio transmissions repeating coordinates, an abandoned map pinned to a barn door, and the hushed speculations of other survivors we met briefly on the road. The idea that pockets of organized quarantine might still persist was enough to keep us moving, especially once we heard about Redstone Garrison, a rumored military outpost that might still be operational, somewhere far to the north, along the edges of older mountainous terrain. We pinned our hopes on that outpost, even when logic said otherwise. In a world tumbling into chaos, it's only natural to latch on to any scrap of possibility. And so we traveled, step by step, mile by mile, each day a new test of endurance. We encountered vacant fields, shuttered homes, and an unsettling quiet that cloaked the roads once teeming with cars and people. I can still recall the smell of the pine forests we left behind, the final caw of crows in an empty sky, the hush settling over farmland where entire families must have once lived. Now it was only us, our hearts beating loud in a silent world, guided by ephemeral whispers that somewhere, a day's trek, a week's trek, or perhaps more, there was a fortress or base, and behind its walls, at least some semblance of order. During these long travels, our group grew into a fragile family. Brent, my companion from the cabin, remained level-headed even when fear threatened to overwhelm us. Ward, while cynical at times, continued to prove he was a man of action, a capable scavenger and defender who often volunteered for the more dangerous tasks. Kara, Todd, and Nolan, strangers to us at first, became integral, each contributing in their unique ways. Kara was the heart of the group, always encouraging us to press on. She had a knack for fixing small mechanical problems, rigging up quick solutions with minimal tools. We spent evenings sharing fragments of our past. Todd's memories of coaching a school team, Kara's recollection of tinkering in her father's workshop, Nolan speaking fondly of his wife, lost early on in the outbreak. Each story was bittersweet, an echo of a world we feared we might never see again. The farmland had transformed into a broken patchwork of collapsed barns, overgrown fields, and battered fences. Occasionally, we spotted abandoned vehicles on old highways, some with shattered windows, others simply out of gas. Early in our journey, we'd found small caches of supplies in these cars, cans of food, bottles of water, but as time went on, everything seemed picked clean. While traveling north, we found a road where the lines had faded to near invisibility. To our left, a vast field swayed with tall grass, rippling in the breeze like an ocean. To our right, a line of trees rose, branches forming a patchy canopy overhead. The hush of the wind, the rustle of grass, even the distant calls of crows, these were the only natural sounds left. When the wind died, the resulting silence was eerie enough to set our teeth on edge. Yet there were nights we found reason to laugh. Small, passing joys like discovering a forgotten jar of peanut butter at the back of a dusty cabinet, or glimpsing a family of non-infected deer that bounded away before we could so much as think of hunting them. Those moments reminded us life still existed outside the infection shadow, if only fleetingly. We'd have been stranded much sooner if not for Ward's battered pickup truck. For a time, it carried us through farmland faster than we could travel on foot, sparing Nolan's injured leg from further strain. However, mechanical breakdowns and scarce fuel eventually spelled its doom. Before the engine finally gave out, we stumbled upon a wildlife lodge where we met Kara, Todd, and Nolan. The lodge had once been a refuge for hikers, but the infection transformed it into a rough shelter. When we arrived, a partial group of survivors was already gone, presumably trying to find an official quarantine center, but leaving behind scattered supplies. Despite the personal tragedies etched onto their faces, Kara, Todd, and Nolan welcomed us cautiously. It didn't take long for us to combine resources and form a single group, each aware that survival rates increased with more pairs of eyes scanning the shadows. As we ventured beyond the lodge, the weather started to shift. Crisp mornings gave way to colder nights, and the occasional drizzle made the roads slick. We improvised tarps and repurposed spare fabric to keep ourselves and our gear dry. More than once, we paused in the middle of nowhere, forced to build a temporary lean-to against sudden downpours, all the while worried that the sound of rainfall might mask approaching infected. We relied on the few radio broadcasts we could intercept. Mostly, we heard static, but once in a while, a looped message from some defunct government channel would stutter through, promising safety at coordinates that matched what Kara had jotted down. Over time, though, the transmissions grew more fragmented until they sometimes seemed like illusions, our minds playing tricks on us in a world desperate for hope. And still we pushed on. One evening, beneath a watercolor sky streaked with orange and pink, we picked up the faintest of signals. Brent and I fiddled with the handheld radio, while Todd stood on a makeshift lookout, scanning for any sign of infected movement. Through the staticky garble came a voice, flat, monotone, barely discernible, for survivors. Redstone Garrison, safe zone, coordinates. It cut in and out, but the repeated mention of Redstone Garrison quickened our pulses. The same name had cropped up in an old government flyer we found pinned to a bulletin board weeks ago. That flyer hinted at a large-scale operation to contain the infection. Could it still be operational? That has to be it, Kara said, eyes shining. They're still broadcasting. That means somebody's there. Even Ward, usually skeptical, managed a half smile. Better than nothing, he admitted. Might as well see if it's real. Thus, we steeled ourselves for yet another leg of the journey. Each step forward was fueled by the promise that soon we might find locked gates, watchtowers, and a real community, somewhere the infection hadn't triumphed. Days stretched into nights, and nights blurred into dawns. We clung to a single strip of highway that snaked through rocky hills. Graffiti scrawled across a crumbling overpass declared, "No hope in dripping letters, a grim counterpoint to our optimism." Eventually, the terrain rose into a series of ridges, each dotted with pines. The air grew colder at these higher elevations. Even the wind tasted different, carrying an edge that reminded me of approaching winter. We rationed our food, limited our water intake, and prayed the next stretch of road wouldn't be blocked by debris. Then, one afternoon, as the pale sun struggled through low-hanging clouds, we finally saw tall floodlight towers on a distant ridge. They jutted like silhouettes against the grey sky. Drawing out our binoculars, we spied a chain-link fence glinting dully in the sparse sunlight, the kind used in larger military compounds. A jolt of excitement coursed through us, especially Kara, who nearly jumped with relief. "It has to be Redstone Garrison," she said breathlessly. Though our hearts pounded with renewed energy, a subdued caution tempered our excitement. We'd seen many illusions on the road, but something about these fences, built with barbed wire, with no immediate sign of collapse, felt distinctly organized. A part of me dared to dream that we'd find real living defenders inside, some final bastion of official authority. Hours later, weaving through a labyrinth of back roads and overgrown parking areas, we reached a heavy metal gate set into a tall fence. An old sign, rusted and knocked off its post, lay half buried in weeds. Wiping away the grime, we read, "Redstone Garrison." The letters were chipped, but unmistakable. "Finally," Todd muttered, eyes darting across the fence line. Brent propped Nolan's cart against a broken traffic barrier. "We'll need to see if there's a guard or some checkpoint instructions," he said. "There must be a reason nobody's greeting us." We stepped forward carefully. The gate itself appeared secure, but as we tested the chain, it shifted slightly, unlocked. Before we could decide whether to enter, a loudspeaker crackled to life overhead, making us jump. "Warning, you are entering Redstone Garrison. Please present identification and proceed to the screening station." The automated voice droned on, emotionless, repeating the directive every few seconds. We froze, scanning for any sign of actual people, guards, staff, someone in a tower. Yet the watchtowers were still, no movement behind their dusty windows. Undeterred, we eased the gate open, half expecting a spotlight to fix on us or an armed patrol to emerge. Nothing happened. Just the loop of the loudspeaker echoing over the empty courtyard. Inside the fence, a wide asphalt lot spread out, segmented by metal barriers and waist-high concrete dividers. Overhead signs labeled the area screening station. The entire setup resembled an airport security line, but far more robust. We saw what looked like scanning equipment, a large console, and the skeleton of a digital sign that must have once displayed warnings. Todd sidled up to a small window, presumably a guard's booth, but it was dark and unmanned. Documents, some official and some hastily handwritten, lay strewn across the booth's counter. One read, "Mandatory quarantine for new arrivals." Another was a partial list of symptoms to report, though the page was so smudged we could barely read it. Our group bunched up, forming a tight circle. The repeated broadcast unsettled us, but it also confirmed some level of electricity or backup power still running. That alone felt like a glimmer of hope. Maybe the garrison wasn't entirely abandoned. Sensing time was precious, we approached a second, heavier gate beyond the screening area. A sign labeled it, "Main Compound Entrance." The gate was made of thick metal slats, reinforced by steel crossbeams. Next to it, we found an access panel with a lever and a keypad. Brent tried the lever, it didn't budge. Ward pried open a small maintenance hatch beneath the panel. Inside, tangled wires and battery terminals blinked with erratic lights. After some trial and error, he managed to pull a manual override lever. The gate groaned in protest, sliding open a few feet before halting. It was enough to slip through. We stepped into a vast interior courtyard, concrete underfoot, high walls and fences forming a perimeter. Looming in the distance were large, boxy buildings, each labelled in stark military font. Barracks A, Barracks B Armory, Command Center. Towering floodlights perched above the walls, though half appeared burnt out or angled downward, uselessly illuminating sections of ground. At the far side of the courtyard, we glimpsed something that made our hearts quiver, figures standing in tattered uniforms. Initially, I nearly called out to them, thinking they might be soldiers or staff. But as we inched closer, the truth became painfully clear. They were infected, each wearing shredded remnants of what appeared to be standard military attire. Some had helmets askew or flak vests hanging loosely. Their posture was slack, heads often tilted. A few swayed gently as if in a half-awake trance. We dropped to a crouch behind a low cement barrier, stunned. I counted maybe 8 or 9 infected in the immediate vicinity. They milled about aimlessly, like guardians of a fortress that no longer served its purpose. "How is this possible?" Kara whispered, trembling. "If the infection spread here, then there's no functioning command left." Ward pressed a finger to his lips, urging silence. Todd's face turned grim, and even Brent, who'd always maintained his composure, seemed shaken. This was the place we had pinned our hopes on, the shining example of an intact outpost. But all we saw were infected staff members. "Maybe there are others," Nolan ventured quietly. "Not everyone could be gone, right?" We clung to that possibility. If a skeleton crew remained, perhaps they'd retreated to deeper parts of the garrison. The presence of lights and an automated voice had to mean someone, or something, was maintaining minimal power. We decided to search systematically, starting with the barracks, then moving on to the command center in hopes of finding a real human presence, or, at the very least, a working radio that we could use to call for outside help. Hugging the walls, we circled the courtyard to avoid the infected. They didn't appear immediately aggressive, but any noise or sudden movement might draw their attention. Nolan's leg made stealth difficult. We eased the cart along, hoping our footsteps wouldn't echo too loudly on the concrete. At Barracks A, the door stood ajar. A battered sign above it read, "Authorized personnel only." Inside, the dim hallway smelled of stale air and antiseptic. Flashlight beams revealed rows of bunk beds, personal lockers, and scattered gear. Posters of scenic vistas and old sports schedules hung crookedly, torn at the edges. On one bunk, we found a journal partially under a pillow. Though water-damaged, we managed to read an entry dated near the start of the zombie outbreak. Day 4 of lockdown. "We have everything locked down, but new cases keep popping up. Some soldiers show strange aggression, others collapse with fever. Command says we need more time for a cure. Morale is low." A couple of pages later, Day 7. "Radio transmissions are inconsistent. Rumor says help is coming from the next state." We wait. Some tried to climb the fence last night to escape. The captain threatened them with court-martial. Are we prisoners here? The final entries were smeared. My eyes scanned the pages with dread, piecing together the inevitable. The infection breached even these walls. This entire base, once a stronghold, gradually fell from within. We found little in the way of supplies. Canned rations had either been taken or left to spoil. In a side room, we discovered a small stash of water purification tablets, which we pocketed. Our search yielded a handful of battered first aid items, but nowhere near what we hoped for. As we exited the barracks, a jolting crash echoed from the far end of the corridor. The door we used had been left partially open. Something or someone had pushed it further. We froze, hearts hammering. Light from the courtyard spilled in, illuminating a lone infected figure in the passageway. It wore a uniform with half a name patch, HA, the rest unreadable. Its eyes were unfocused, limbs stiff. Our group huddled in a side nook behind a fallen locker, holding our breath. The infected soldier shuffled forward, moaning faintly. When it bumped into a bunk, it let out a rattled gasp, almost like a lost sigh. Tension tightened in my chest. If it discovered us, it would certainly alert others. Luckily, the infected soldier soon turned around, stumbling back toward the courtyard. We exhaled in silent relief, then quietly slipped out another exit leading to the outer walkway. The entire garrison felt like a haunted labyrinth, corridors and courtyards patrolled by half-lucid remnants of once organized military. Once outside, we heard the loudspeaker again, echoing across the open space. "All personnel, proceed to primary station for evacuation. All personnel, proceed to primary station." The voice repeated the message in an endless loop. It had the same flat mechanical tone as the initial greeting, no human variation or urgency. Todd, leaning on a metal railing, looked deeply unsettled. "They left these announcements running, like a decoy." Brent grimaced. "Or they planned to come back, but never did. Either way, it felt like a mocking invitation." We pressed on, inching closer to the command center. Among the buildings, we caught glimpses of more infected. some at the edges of the yard, some disappearing around corners. They moved slowly, but in groups, their silhouettes eerily uniform under leftover gear. Before reaching the command center, we passed by the armory. Its reinforced door was locked, steel barriers preventing easy entry. Ward tested the handle and found no give. Beyond the narrow windows, we saw flickers of movement, perhaps more infected inside. A sign on the door read, "Armory lockdown in effect. Authorized clearance required." We decided not to risk a forced entry. The metal looked thick, and making noise could bring the infected down on us. Instead, we slid along the side of the building, heading deeper into the central courtyard. Overhead, the sky had started to dim into early evening, the sun dipping behind the tall walls. That ominous half-light made every shape and shadow more threatening. At last, we stood before a large structure with faded letters overhead, Command Center. A robust entry door was set into the concrete, flanked by broken security cameras. An old sign posted near the entrance detailed something called Operation Containment, referencing city quarantines, and an official seal we didn't recognize. A chill skittered down my spine. This place had evidently been a linchpin in the government's plan to confine the outbreak. Prying the main door open took several minutes of straining. The steel frame hadn't been unlocked in a long time. Every inch we pried produced a shriek of metal. I worried the sound would attract infected from the courtyard, but we had no other way in. Finally, with a final grunt, we slid through. Flickering emergency lights illuminated a lobby lined with posters urging soldiers to report all symptoms and maintain moral standards. The floor was strewn with scattered files, bullet casings, and an unsettling dryness, like nobody had set foot here in months. Doors branched off in multiple directions, some locked, some ajar. One corridor was labeled Communications. That was our likely target if we wanted to find any working radio system. Another corridor led to offices, Logistics, Staff HQ, Medical Unit. We considered searching them all, but first, we had to see if a main broadcast station could still be used to call for help. While we stood in the dim lobby, I caught the haunted looks on my companions' faces. Kara clutched her pack straps so tightly her knuckles turned white. Todd hovered protectively over Nolan's cart, eyes darting at every shadow. Ward, usually the bold one, seemed at a loss for words. Brent's expression was guarded, his jaw set in determination. We had expected an uncertain reception, perhaps suspicious guards or strict quarantine protocols. But an empty facility with infected staff wandering about was beyond our worst imaginings. In that moment, the voice in my mind whispered what I dared not say out loud. There really might be no safe zone left. We followed a hallway deeper into the building. Emergency lights flickered overhead, painting everything in a sickly glow. Faded directional arrows on the floor guided us. Several times we passed rooms where interior windows revealed chaotic scenes. Chairs overturned, bullet holes in walls, half-eaten rations on tables. The entire command center felt like a place that had been abandoned in a hurry, yet sealed off from the outside world. At length, we found a double door marked Communications. One panel was slightly ajar, revealing a cramped control room beyond. The smell of dust and stale electronics hit us immediately. Banks of monitors, radio consoles, and shelves stacked with technical manuals filled the space. A single overhead light blinked with irregular pulses, reminding me of an old emergency generator, straining to keep some circuits alive. Kara rushed to the nearest console. Switching on a frequency dial, she winced at a burst of static. "Let's see if we can broadcast," she said, her voice trembling with equal parts excitement and dread. Brent tried flipping toggle switches on another console. Ward scanned the room for any sign of hidden threats. Todd helped Nolan settle on a chair near the door where he could rest his injured leg. Static. That was the only reply at first. But then, to our surprise, a faint signal emerged. A recorded message in that same monotone voice. "Survivors, proceed to Redstone Garrison at coordinates. This is a safe zone. Repeat, proceed to..." The loop stuttered, repeating itself. Anger flared in my chest. This was the broadcast that lured us here. The broadcast that might have been playing for months without any living humans behind it. Still, Kara tried to override it, pressing down on a microphone switch. "Hello? Anyone receiving? We have survivors at Redstone Garrison. Please respond." She repeated variations of that call, adjusting knobs and scanning different frequencies. The result was unchanging. Static, followed by the same pre-recorded lure. After a few tense minutes, Ward let out a frustrated sigh. "It's a trap, isn't it? Or if it wasn't originally, it might as well be now." Todd discovered a battered clipboard near one console, sheets of typed text referencing Operation Containment. The more we read, the colder our blood ran. Operation Containment. Localize infected in a secure perimeter. Maintain continuous automated broadcasts to entice infected away from population centers. Prevent infected from exiting once inside, ensuring minimal spread to other regions. If the site is compromised, no retrieval efforts will be attempted. It was all there in black and white. Redstone Garrison was intended to function as a decoy. Automated systems kept the infected herded within these walls, using loops that once might have attracted infected away from cities, or lured hopeful survivors who ended up trapped. My heart sank, an ache blooming in my chest at the realization that we were now inside this lethal snare. Our anxious whispers and tinkering with radio equipment must have echoed beyond the door, because we soon heard a muffled banging in the corridor. Low groans, scuffs, and the telltale stuttered breathing of infected. They had picked up our scent, or maybe the noise. In any case, the door to the communications room rattled softly, then more forcefully. "They're here," Brent said, quietly raising his rifle. Kara powered down the console, hoping to reduce the noise and flickering lights. Nolan braced his cart against a desk, eyes wide. "Is there a back exit?" asked Ward, scanning the corners of the room. One door near the rear looked promising, but a red keypad next to it suggested a locked passage. Todd checked it, pressing a few random sequences on the keypad. No luck. Looks like it needs an access code. Outside, the infected pressed closer, their moans growing louder. One of them must have slammed into the door because we heard the metal frame shudder on its hinges. We knew we couldn't remain cooped up here. If more infected joined, they might tear through the door. Yet leaving meant possibly facing an even larger group in the corridors. Ward checked his pockets, producing a single flare, the last one we had. "I can toss this down the hallway as a distraction." We slipped past in the opposite direction. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all we had. Brent and I braced ourselves near the entrance, while Todd and Kara helped Nolan prepare to move quickly. On the count of 3, Ward yanked the door open. At least 4 infected stumbled forward, former soldiers, their uniforms tattered, faces slack with the infection's blank stare. He ignited the flare and tossed it down the corridor to the right. The sudden burst of light and smoke drew the infected's gaze. They turned that way with guttural moans, giving us a narrow path to skirt left. Heart pounding, I led the way, brandishing my makeshift spear, originally a sharpened broom handle, to ward off any stragglers. We rushed into the hallway, stepping over toppled chairs and broken glass. The infected, drawn to the flare, reached for it with clumsy motions, snarling. A few noticed us, letting out wails, but we were already past them, weaving toward a set of double doors marked Main Corridor. Kara nearly slipped on a patch of spilled liquid. Ward caught her arm, steadying her. The entire building reverberated with those eerie moans, echoing off walls and twisting into a chorus of fear. We had no choice but to keep moving. Pushing through the double doors, we found ourselves back in the large courtyard. The twilight sky overhead had given way to early night, and the floodlights flickered on automatically, illuminating the gloom with harsh cones of fluorescent white. To our horror, the infected in the courtyard seemed more animated now, perhaps alerted by the noise inside the command center. Uniformed figures drifted around, some in small clusters, scanning the area with vacant stares. We crouched behind a row of crates near a pile of sandbags. Beyond them, in the distance, the main gates we'd entered through stood partially open. If we could slip past the infected, maybe we could exit the garrison. But a dreadful sight caught my attention. The gates were shifting. An automated mechanism, possibly triggered by a timer or sensors, was closing them. Metal gears whined and groaned, sliding the heavy barrier shut inch by inch. Ward uttered a shaky exhalation. "We've got to get out before that gate closes completely." Yet a ring of infected spread across the courtyard between us and the exit. At least 10 or 12 figures moved in restless patterns, some wearing bulletproof vests or helmets. Others had basic uniform pieces half hanging off. A few turned at the squeal of the gate's mechanism moaning softly. Nolan leaned forward, eyes filled with dread. "We'll never push my cart through that crowd in time." Kara tried to look brave, but her voice quivered. "We can't leave you behind." Todd, clenching his jaw, nodded. "We do this together." We formulated a desperate plan. Use the leftover flare from inside, if we still had one, and the last of our noisemakers, an old can with pebbles, to lure the infected away from the gate. Then we'd sprint through the gap before it shut. But Ward had used his final flare in the communications corridor. We were down to only the can. It was hardly enough to cause a real distraction for so many infected, especially in a large open space. "You folks seeing that watchtower?" Brent whispered, pointing to the southern edge. Indeed, a tall watchtower rose above the walls, accessible by a ramp. "Maybe from up there, we can see if there's another exit, or if there's a section of wall we can climb over." Even if it was a risk, it seemed better than charging straight into the throng of infected. We decided to try for the tower. If we got a vantage point, we might find a safe route out. If the gates fully sealed, perhaps there was a back entrance or a break in the fence. Anything to avoid a direct confrontation with so many infected. We stuck close to the courtyard's perimeter, using every bit of cover. Stacked crates, pillars, half-collapsed scaffolding. A series of low offices lined the walls, each with boarded windows. The infected moved like waves, drifting away briefly, then converging again with low moans. Every step we took felt like a gamble. About halfway across, our luck ran thin. One infected soldier, a figure with a fractured visor, spotted our movement. It jerked upright, letting out a guttural call. Several others snapped their heads in our direction. The next seconds were chaos. We scrambled faster, heartbeats thundering in our ears. "Go! Go!" Brent hissed, practically dragging me forward. Kara pushed Nolan's cart, Todd at the rear, and Ward on the left flank, rifle raised but carefully avoiding gunshots that would draw the entire horde. Infected figures lurched toward us, arms twitching. We swerved around a corner of concrete barriers. Ward used a piece of debris to knock aside one infected that got too close, sending it sprawling with a dull thud. Another reached out, nearly grabbing Todd's sleeve, but he managed to jerk free. We raced along the base of the tower ramp, a slope of steel that ascended to a small entrance. The door was open, unguarded, a mercy in this dire situation. Scrambling inside, we slammed the door behind us, bracing it with a length of metal pipe. Outside we heard the infected gather, pounding on the barrier with heavy thuds. The interior was cramped, lit only by a single dangling emergency lamp. A spiral staircase led to the top. Ward, breath coming in ragged gulps, pressed an ear to the door. "They're right outside," he muttered. Brent leaned against the wall, eyes shut, as if trying to calm his racing pulse. "If we can get to the top, maybe we'll find a vantage point or a radio, or even a rope we can use to scale down the outer wall." Nolan shifted uncomfortably in the cart. We realized it would be almost impossible to maneuver him up the spiral staircase while he was in that cart. He noticed our hesitation and quietly said, "I can lean on someone's shoulder. We'll leave the cart behind if we must." Kara and Todd helped him stand. He winced, gripping Todd's arm as they guided him to the staircase. "It's okay," he insisted, face twisted in pain. "We came this far. I'm not giving up now." Step by step, we ascended the narrow staircase, the metallic clang of our footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The higher we went, the more we could feel the building sway in the wind. Occasional slit windows provided glimpses of the courtyard. Infected dotted the grounds like lost souls, moaning and stumbling in random patterns. After an exhausting climb, we reached a sturdy hatch that opened into the watchtower's observation room. With a groan of protesting hinges, we pulled it open. The room was a cramped octagon, windows on all sides, a weather-beaten console, and a few dusty chairs. It must have once housed a vigilant watch crew, scanning for threats and coordinating defenses. Now, it was as lifeless as the rest of the garrison. Yet we had a panoramic view. In all directions, the walls enclosed a sprawling layout of buildings and yards. Beyond the perimeter fence, we saw even more infected gathering in the fields, possibly drawn by the base's endless broadcasts and lights. Under the harsh floodlights, it looked like an entire settlement of infected, waiting for something to happen. A battered loudspeaker on the tower crackled, repeating the same call. All personnel proceed to primary station for evacuation. The twisted irony was almost too much to bear. Brent and I approached the windows, scanning for any alternate exit. In one corner of the base, near the armory, was a smaller gate. But from our vantage, it was sealed shut, a thick chain looped around it. The main gate had now fully closed, the heavy doors interlocking. On top of that, infected swarmed near the gate, apparently drawn to the noise of the closing mechanism. Todd checked the eastern perimeter, noticing a partially collapsed section of fence. "There, look," he said, pointing. "That fence might be compromised. We could slip out." We squinted, spotting a large pile of rubble and twisted fencing near one corner. However, a group of about 7 or 8 infected lurked in that general area, weaving between the debris. Without a major distraction, we'd never get past them. And even if we did, the open field beyond was littered with more infected. Nolan slumped against the wall, pain etched on his face, but also a grim acceptance. We're surrounded. Kara noticed a smaller control panel in the corner. Its lights glowed faintly. "Maybe we can override some of the gates or cause a distraction with these floodlights," she said. We crowded around as she tapped a few keys. The screen displayed a basic interface for tower operations: spotlights, alarms, gate controls. But every command returned an access denied message or a system locked indicator. This place was locked down from a higher level, presumably in the command center we'd already fled. In frustration, Kara hammered a button labeled Manual Broadcast. The console beeped. A microphone icon appeared on the small screen, prompting a passcode. She tried some guesses. 1234, 0000, standard defaults, but none worked. Another dead end. Outside, the infected continued their aimless patrol. We could even see a few pressing themselves against the tower's base, as if sniffing out our presence. The top windows were too high for them to reach, but eventually, if they kept pounding on the door, they might break through. Exhaustion seeped into our bones. We'd been on high alert for hours, maybe days, with minimal sleep. The emotional toll of discovering Redstone Garrison was a decoy weighed heavily. Everything we'd endured, the long trek, the near misses, had led us to a place designed in part to confine the infected and trick survivors. The silence in the tower was thick with despair. "Maybe we'll have to wait them out," Ward said, pacing near a window. "If daylight comes, maybe some of them wander off." Todd rubbed his forehead, doubt plain on his features. With all these automated lights and announcements, they seemed content to stay. Kara let out a shaky breath. "We've outrun them before, but not in these numbers." She glanced at Nolan. "And not with your leg how it is." Nolan said nothing, studying the metal floor. Eventually he spoke in a resigned whisper. "I'm sorry. If I wasn't slowing everyone down." I felt a surge of protective anger. "Don't ever think that," I said. "We're in this together." At some point past midnight, as we peered out the windows, I thought I saw flashing lights beyond the outer fence, like headlights or flashlights dancing in the distant darkness. I couldn't be sure if it was my tired eyes or a genuine sign of human activity. Kara saw it too and gasped, but when we looked again, the lights vanished. Even if there were people out there, they clearly weren't heading in. Perhaps they'd glimpsed the infected mass and decided to flee. Part of me couldn't blame them. A grinding noise echoed across the compound, metal gears engaging. The perimeter floodlights flickered, intensifying in brightness as they swept across the courtyard. Suddenly, one beam locked onto a group of infected, causing them to moan louder and shuffle in unison. Another beam swung towards the tower, momentarily blinding us through the windows. The floodlights had become searchlights, scanning the ground, as if an automated system was trying to corral the infected. The echo of more recorded announcements followed. I recalled the details of Operation Containment. These lights and announcements might be a last-ditch measure to keep the infected inside and away from living populations. From the tower vantage, we watched as more infected approached from the outer fields, drawn in by the lights and the broadcasts. Their silhouettes merged with those inside the perimeter. It was like watching a tide roll in, shuffling forms and low moans merging into a single dreadful sea. No corners of the yard seemed safe anymore. Ward, face pale, whispered, "We're not just locked in here with them, they're locking them in with us." Hours passed in tense waiting. We took turns resting against the walls, cradling weapons in our laps, jolting awake at every scrape of metal below. Brent managed to drift off for a short while. Kara sat near Nolan, offering him sips of water. Todd paced the cramped space, occasionally muttering strategies under his breath, none workable. I stared at the single overhead light, flickering in a rhythmic pattern, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. Memories of the cabin drifted through my thoughts, the crackling fireplace, the smell of pine. How naive we were to believe it was a reliable hideaway. Then the image of the farmland lodge with Kara, Todd, and Nolan, the sense of camaraderie that had given us all new reason to hope. All of it now seemed a dream. Eventually, the early dawn light started seeping over the horizon, although the sky remained gloomily overcast. From the watchtower windows, we had a clearer view of just how many infected had gathered both inside and outside the walls. It looked like hundreds in total. The once organized base turned into an infected city. Some stood idle, others wandered aimlessly. More pressed up against the walls, and still others congregated near the gates as if waiting for them to open. The gates, the fences, the sealed buildings. Todd said softly, "This was never meant for us. It was meant to keep them in." "And it worked," Kara added, voice heavy with despair, "until it trapped us too." We busied ourselves searching the watchtower for any last-ditch escape method. The upper control panel refused every override attempt. The ropes and harnesses, if there ever were any, had vanished. There was a small storage closet containing only a few rusted maintenance tools. A hammer, some nails, a frayed rope too short for a safe descent. We even checked the windows to see if we could climb down. From the tower top to the ground was at least a 4-story drop onto solid concrete. Jumping was unthinkable, especially with an injured companion. As midday approached, hunger gnawed at our bellies, and thirst crept up on us. We had only minimal rations, barely enough for another day or two. The water supply was low. The realization sank in that we might not have days left, not with so many infected methodically searching. The door below us rattled intermittently as infected figures tested it, moaning. In time, the barricade might fail. Standing by a window, I watched the main gate again. Some internal mechanism had sealed it shut, and I saw no sign of movement beyond. That faint flash of lights from the previous night never returned. If any other survivors roamed nearby, they seemed unwilling to brave the swarm. Could I blame them? Brent joined me, placing a tentative hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "We did everything we could." I nodded, fighting back a swell of emotion. "We had to try," I whispered. The loudspeakers kept chanting at intervals. "All personnel, proceed to primary station for evacuation." The words felt like mockery, a final cruelty from an abandoned plan. We tried to block it out, but the repetition drilled into our minds, underscoring the hopelessness. Kara, huddled near Nolan, wiped a tear from her cheek. "We gave it our best," she murmured, but her face was drawn, eyes full of quiet resignation. Todd slumped against a console, closing his eyes, weariness etched into every line of his face. Ward just stared at the door, every muscle coiled as if waiting for an impossible rescue or a final standoff. Afternoon shadows stretched across the courtyard. More infected shuffled into the tower's base, ramming the barricade, pounding in unison. The metal pipe we used to brace the door screeched under the strain. Each impact sent vibrations through the staircase, up into the observation room. We formed a tight circle near the center of the small space. No words left to say, only the shared gaze of those who understood that not every story ends in safety. Some part of me still raged against it, wanting to tear at the walls, to do something that might turn the tide. But no plan presented itself. Bang. Bang. The door below began to cave, each strike more forceful than the last. Outside, the sky turned a dull grey as clouds rolled in, wind picking up across the compound. I saw the silhouettes of infected scaling the ramp, pressing against each other, an unstoppable wave. Nolan's eyes met mine. He forced a small, brave smile. "At least we're together," he whispered. Brent's hand tightened around mine. Ward exhaled slowly, rifle in hand but with nowhere left to aim. Todd mumbled something that might have been a prayer, while Kara locked her eyes shut, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. Crash! The final blow splintered the barricade. We heard infected pouring into the base of the tower, filling the staircase with a chorus of moans. Footsteps thumped on the metal steps. They were coming. We braced for an onslaught we had no real hope of surviving. I glanced once more out the window at the horizon beyond the walls, imagining a world we'd never see. A place where the infection might not have reached, or a functioning quarantine site that truly protected its people. But if such a place existed, it was far from here. "All personnel proceed to primary station." The loudspeaker repeated its hollow invitation, an endless loop that meant nothing now. Then the door to the tower observation room buckled as infected hurled themselves against it. Metal tore. A hinge popped with a sharp squeal. Cold air rushed in, along with the stench of decay and the furious moans of the infected. We closed ranks, hearts pounding, each of us determined to face whatever came next with what dignity we could muster. In that final moment, I felt an unexpected calm, an acceptance, though laced with sorrow. After all we'd endured, after all the hope we carried, this was the end of our journey. The last thing I recall is the door giving way completely, a flood of movement, and the loudspeaker overhead repeating its meaningless directive. No more safe zones, no last-minute rescues, only the relentless tide of an infection that consumed everything in its path. Thank you for listening. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse.